Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. A check-in interview with Pete Oberle, the managing partner of Trailhead Capital, on his journey into the food and ag space and the latest investments made by the fund. Among them, a regenerative, cultivated, lab-grown meat company, which should help regenerative farmers 20 or even 100x their protein output. Does that make you cringe or very interested? We unpack it all in this interview. This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investinginregenag. That is gumroad.com/investinginregenag. Or find the link below. Welcome to another interview, today with the managing partner of Trailhead Capital. Welcome, Pete.
Koen, thank you. Great to be here.
And thank you so much for joining us on this late or early hour, depending on how you look at it. But I'm very interested. We've interviewed your two of your other co-founders and managing partners, which obviously we'll link below in the interviews. But as a fund, as a first-time fund in this space, and one of the few funds in the space, obviously, there's a lot to discuss because you've been making investments. But we'll get to that in a minute. I would love to start with the personal question we always start with. How did you end up in this space and focusing so much on soil regeneration and then ending up setting up one of the first VC funds in the space here?
Yeah, great question. Really, I got into it from a human health perspective. My background, I was trying to play football for far too long. In the process, it motivated me to optimize human performance, but it also led to a lot of injuries and too many surgeries. So, just
American football, soccer, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, American football.
Global level. American football, okay. Which I think gets more injuries almost than soccer, or not? It's quite a tough sport, right?
Both fairly injury prone, but a few more contact injuries in American football.
Yeah. And how did you discover food then I wouldn't say as a medicine, because let's not go there yet, but as is that a thing in American football, that food, what you're eating, and is that important? And then how would you describe, let's say, the current thinking or the current general thinking in American football around food?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I probably am a little out of date in terms of how American football specifically is thinking about it. But at the time, and of course, this was the eye-opener. This is going back to the 80s and 90s when I was playing. And really, we were taught to focus on macronutrients and essentially cut fats out of our diet. So at the time, there was very little known or consideration given to that food. But really, the evolution for me was, I had gotten, background there was going from, those surgeries. I basically got out of college, got into investment banking. I went into the life sciences group because I was focused on regenerative cartilage. I got exposed to ag bio companies at the time. Ultimately, went back to business school, joined a private equity fund. But along the way, where diet came back into the picture and a better understanding of the importance of the quality food was I was introduced to the Paleo Diet. This was about 2011. So
which is quite a shift from not including fat to paleo. Just as a background, paleo, what is paleo, the diet, just for people that are thinking, yeah, I heard about it, but they don't really know what it is? How would you describe it?
Yeah, broadly, it is Well, they would tell you no grains, no dairy, no legumes, and avoid processed foods while focusing on good, healthy fats, including animal fats, nuts, etc. But, of course, the more you look into that, you understand some of the nuances to those grains and to that dairy. So when you get into the ancient grains, basically the premise for paleo is avoiding the inflammation and leaky gut that some of those inflammatory foods can cause. So if you get to ancient grains that are a little bit more historically agreeable with the human digestive system, then you can avoid some of the ramifications of that. So
it's basically taking us back to what we think, which is very debatable, and for many sides, what we used to eat before we started agriculture, or before we stopped being mostly hunter-gatherer, etc. But did you still remember how, because when you first hear that, and you've always been taught that fat is bad, etc., like, did it hit you immediately like, oh, this is interesting? Or was there resistance first? Like, do you still remember when the first time I wouldn't say saw paleo, but the first time you took it seriously? What was your response there?
Yeah, total skepticism. It didn't make any sense to me. It was like, okay, everything you're telling me is pretty much the opposite of what I've been taught my entire life. But truthfully, at the time, I was working for a private equity fund in Japan. The Fukushima meltdown and earthquake and tsunami had just happened. And so I think we were in a space where we were willing to explore and just searching for answers and things to kind of take our mind off of what just happened there. But, I doubted it very, very strongly. But, as a result, I had to try it and turned into a little bit of a biohacker in the process. So basically, to prove it out was getting essentially monthly blood tests to track my biomarkers. And, not surprisingly, basically everything improved significantly. So,
you remember that first time when you saw those biomarkers and you were sure, well, no, maybe you already felt better, but that you were sure this was not going to work. Did you feel better the first time you did the blood test? Because then maybe you had a hunch like, okay, this might be a bit not what I expected, or like, how was that process?
Actually, that's a great question. Going back to how did I feel? Like, thinking about the process, it took a few weeks for the body to adapt. Well, in even the taste buds, taking out some of those sugary foods. But, within a matter of weeks, it kind of felt like my mouth was reprogrammed, and otherwise bitter or plain foods were, so much richer. So I had some hopes, but still some skepticism. But when I started getting those results back, it was hard to argue with. I wasn't in a terrible condition, but it was noticeable enough to be able to attribute it directly to dietary changes. That was what really opened up the rabbit hole for me. So I started paying attention to ingredients in foods, realized how hard it was at the time, and of course this is just 11 years ago, to really understand the quality of the ingredients. I basically had to start at just a level where there wasn't bad stuff in there. There wasn't stuff I didn't understand. But necessarily, I was still operating at that private equity fund, but decided to start angel investing in the space. That started with some high-end CPG companies, but really wanted to start getting closer and closer to the source. So started investing in human gut microbiome companies and gave me a better idea of the causes and ramifications of inflammation, and ultimately took that back to the source and started looking directly at ag opportunities, both in land and tech. I continued doing that, left private equity, took a year off, really wanted to give some thought to how I could better contribute to the world, and in the process saw firsthand how badly the environment needed so much help. Unfortunately, at the time, I was exposed to regenerative agriculture, and it just became so blatantly obvious about the importance of soil health in improving human and planetary health. So that, because that's
it's an interesting step beyond. Let's go back to our ancient diet, and of course we can discuss like what we used to eat 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. It's not the same meat, it's not the same grain, it's not the same, etc. But I've also seen many people simply saying paleo, okay, I need to eat a lot of animal protein, no legumes, no this, that, but not going the step beyond thinking, okay, how this meat was grown? Like what did this cow ate, or et cetera, et cetera. So do you remember, because it's not so obvious that this turns into a rabbit hole. It could be simply stopping there. Like, okay, I don't do processed food anymore. I don't do grains. I do a lot of animal protein and I feel a lot better regardless of where this comes from. And that's okay. And that's it. But no, you took it a few steps further and actually way further than that. Do you remember, was it just simply you being curious, or were you already aware like, ooh, this could be quite an energy intensive way of eating if we're feeding it grain and corn and soy? Or was it an environmental question? Like why did you kept digging into, at the end, into the soil?
Yeah, it was a combination of things looking back on it. There was the trigger that was set off in just that, what I mentioned before, when you basically turn the information you've been schooled in on its head and have better outcomes through it. So that definitely triggered in me a desire to explore and understand more and really start to question everything. But I think in terms of environment, it also, it raised somewhat of an inherent conflict in me just trying to understand. So, okay, well, first I'll qualify. I certainly appreciate Paleo Diet. There are a million diets out there for a reason. There's a lot of different heritages and evolutions of populations over time, so it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. But that said, assuming this approach works for a variety of people, is that really telling us that we need to ramp up production and consumption of meat? And can this world really sustain that? So, it triggered in me the desire to look into meat production, better understand that. And, of course, it's crazy when you start to dive down that rabbit hole, right? How little we know, how disconnected we are from the food system. So really starting to learn what a CAFO operation is really like. Obviously, it's eye-opening and disheartening. So,
do you still want to eat that, even if it's better than whatever factory bread you were eating, or etc.? Yeah, that's an interesting question. That we try to often not to see that, or prefer not to see that. But at the moment you see it, you cannot unsee it anymore, and then you have to act. Otherwise, it would just be a very, very big conflict in your head.
Well, and I'm sure you know all too well, there's a very conscious effort to hide that from, the public-facing aspect. And,
on most of those packaging, there is a happy cow in the pasture somewhere. Yeah, on the packaging at least.
Yeah, that's right. It was, a large part of it was trying to understand, okay, this approach is clearly working for me. And if this is what the vast or, a significant portion of the population historically followed, then, how does that possibly work? Because it did inherently make sense to me that, relying on the intelligence of nature is the right thing to do. So,
and that production piece, like feeding the world, is something that people are like, but how we're going to feed the world in this? Like, you've done the analysis, you've looked into this. What is your normal response? Like at a dinner party, I don't know if you only have friends that are into Regen Ag and Food, but let's say you meet somebody that isn't, or like, that all sounds great, Pete, but how we're going to feed the world? Like, what is your response? I'm not looking for the answer here because it's extremely complex. But how do you respond to that normally without scaring away like all the dinner party guests with a 2-hour deep dive into production numbers and complexifying agroforestry, silvopasture, etc.? Like, what's your? I'm asking for a friend. Like, I'm looking for a few sentences here or an interesting story that can trigger an interesting conversation around feeding the world. What's your natural response there?
My natural response these days, of course, there are a lot of questions and nuances to scaling regenerative agriculture, but, also qualify when you consider Trailhead and our focus. We focus on on-farm opportunities, supply chain opportunities, and consumer-related opportunities. I happen to focus on the supply chain. So when that question is posed that you suggested, how do we feed the world? I say, feeding the world is not the problem. 800 million people go to bed hungry every night. That's 10% of the population. We waste 30 to 40% of the food that we produce. So really, I think first and foremost, that is where we need to focus a lot of our attention in terms of just improving the efficiency and reducing the waste in our system.
I think that's a good one. And plus, I think that 2 billion people are overweight or let's say consuming more calories than they have to. And so it seems mostly a distribution problem. If we purely look at calories and not at the quality of calories, which we definitely should look at,
yes.
But it's not that we don't produce enough food now and we're still not feeding the world because like 10% goes to bed hungry and 20% goes to bed overeating, which in many different ways, I'm not saying it's their fault, but it's the food system we created is not feeding us. And so we better figure out a solution there. So how did you then end up saying you started making angel investments, you mentioned?
Yeah.
Some people set up a fund at some point, some people don't. What was the step there to say, okay, we need a bigger organization and an institute basically to start doing these kind of investments at a larger scale in the regen ag and food space. And it's not enough if I'm investing my own money into a number of angel deals a year. Yeah, when did you see that opportunity? Like, what was there? Like, this is actually more than a side thing. This could be the main thing.
It kind of came knocking on my door. I had left private equity, made the decision to focus on angel investing in this space full time. But luckily reconnected with Trip, who's actually a longtime friend. And we started comparing notes, and this is in 2019. And he was at the time specifically looking for a couple partners to raise and launch a regenerative agriculture fund with him and Bobby, our fourth partner, who I don't think you've spoken to yet. No. So,
he's on the list.
We appreciate that. So the more we talked about it, while of course angel investing was intriguing to me, I also came to appreciate the challenges of adding value and the need for a broader scale approach. Just better understanding the complexity of the food and ag system. The more I talked about it with Trip and started to discuss it with the other partners, we were able to piece together a vision that was comprehensive and connected some of the disparate pieces in that mission to improve some of the challenges in the current food and ag system. So, the stars aligned in that regard, and at the time it just made sense to form a fund together, particularly given the different skill sets and experiences and networks each one of us are bringing, because there was fortunately relatively little crossover with each of those.
And just for the people that didn't listen to the previous interviews, which again I will link below with Mark and with Trip, in a few sentences, what is Trailhead? I mean, it didn't change a lot, I think, except that you made more investments. But in a few sentences, it's always nice to hear from another partner as well, how you would describe Trailhead and where you're at. We're now talking end of Q1 2022, so end of March, beginning of April, when this will be out. I mean, depending when you listen to this. So how would you describe Trailhead now if somebody asks you what is Trailhead to you?
Yeah, really, in just a couple sentences, Trailhead is a venture capital fund investing in early stage regenerative ag and food companies that improve soil health either directly or indirectly. They also increase profitability for the regenerative farmer while improving access and affordability for the regenerative consumer. So, as you may have gathered from the conversation thus far, certainly consider ourselves mission-driven, as we truly believe regenerative agriculture presents the greatest opportunity for improving human and planetary health. We believe that opportunity necessarily provides for market returns or better, and while we're investing in inherently impact-oriented companies. So
yeah, we had an interesting discussion with Mark, a conversation with Mark. Discussion sounds too heavy. On if there was tension between regeneration and hunting for unicorns, which I think I called the episode, and he gave a very interesting answer that I've since repeated many times. Like he said, maybe eventually not, if we've regenerated enough land, enough people, enough communities, enough companies, etc. But there is a window now where he feels, and I think you agree, where there are definitely opportunities for outsized returns, because let's say we're so far below zero that there's so much to do that there is the potential growth rate or the potential curve of just soil carbon levels or nutrient deficits, etc., is so large that there are opportunities for outsized returns, even though those returns are maybe a lot higher than let's say an old growth forest can sustain, which maybe is like 3%, people have calculated. So there's an interesting moment there. We're so far below that there might be interesting moments for unicorns, although some people might think, oh, unicorns in regen ag, or regen ag and food, should that even be possible, etc. So I like the tension there. What do you see? You're saying outside returns or venture capital returns. When investors ask that question, do you have another answer to that? Like what do you tell them when they put on that skeptical face?
Yeah, I think we tell them, and it necessarily needs to be addressed more often than I would have thought, in that, necessarily saying it's impact oriented. I think, investors in our fund or in the market generally think that comes with concessionary returns. But
you would think that we've tackled that with, I don't know, even Beyond Burger or Tesla. I mean, there's some interesting, with all the debate around them, but some interesting impacts returns. People, I mean, if you were early in that, you made some Oatly as well, some interesting runs, let's say. And still you feel that skepticism when you have been going out into the market?
I think it may not be skepticism, but it warrants addressing and explaining that because this is impact oriented, it is not concessionary. Yeah. It is, I think the explanation and putting it in perspective is, because of the outsized opportunity in improving human planetary health, we expect outsized returns. But look at the food and ag venture capital investment spectrum historically. And really, we consider a lot of the investments that we're participating in food tech or ag tech, but with a regenerative filter layered in there. So if you look at that market historically, that's right. Ag tech and food tech combined up until about 2020 had somewhere around 8 unicorns historically, 8 exits over $1 billion. But in the last few years, those have accelerated rapidly. Historically, a lot of the companies were acquired in relatively early stages by some of the big strategic players to take them off the market, or simply because they didn't have the luxury of venture investing in the first place, because that was historically about 2% of the capital contributed to early stage startups, because historically food and ag companies took longer to develop and more capital to develop. So it wasn't as compelling a venture capital investment. But we're at a point where consumer demand and awareness is significant enough and tech has improved enough that both of those factors together can accelerate that timeline and provide for those outside returns.
And let's talk about the portfolio. Like what investments have you made recently? What are some exciting ones we can share? I mean, they're all on the website. Your portfolio is on the website, so we're not disclosing any secrets here or scoops or news. But I still would like to unpack a few of them. What investments? Let's say also in your part of the investment theme, have you been most excited about?
I would say so. Really, since you last talked to one of my partners, we've been making investments in that address waste reduction, traceability, transparency, carbon markets, and regenerative meat. So, as I mentioned, really I focus on the supply chain, and broadly, to me, that means trying to improve efficiency and connectivity in the regen system. So we see that minimizing the role of the middleman, enabling decentralization, and reducing some of the waste that we talked about, because, bottom line, we want to increase that 8% of the price that's going to the farmer. To try and move the ball in the right direction for all of those characteristics, one of the investments we made and great companies we partnered with was Food Maven. So, not sure if you've heard of or seen Food Maven before, but they made a bit of a pivot and really now provide better tracking and pricing for food items, including those that are regeneratively sourced. So They do this by having restaurants and other institutional food buyers download a browser extension. They're able to see real-time prices across a broad distributor network, and in the process, select for regen characteristics. So they've also partnered with Google to help build out the Internet of Food that Google Food for Good has proposed, which is really, addressing one of the major issues with the food system. It's just disparate and disconnected. So that effort, really through some of the technology and software that FoodMaven provides, enables better transparency into the various nodes in the system and therefore better connectivity. So yeah, we love FoodMaven for a lot of reasons, but one in particular is the ability to increase awareness and demand for regeneratively produced food.
Which is something you see as an opportunity or something that's still lacking in terms of it's great to have many more farmers in transition, but if nobody buys it or nobody knows it's there and it goes into the standard, even the standard organic commodity markets, we sort of, if you would be certified, we sort of lose that potential for storytelling, for premiums, for food as medicine, for nutrient density. Like we lose all of that because it just goes into the big pile. Like it seems like you've been making investments specifically to tackle that, to decommodify these, which is not really a word I found out actually, but I've been using it, decommodify the supply chains or these supply webs.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, certainly more regenerative food needs to be produced. But yeah, I mean, for one of the elements that FoodMaven addresses that I didn't even touch on is basically they automate aggregation of food items, which is, if you really understand that, it's surprisingly hard because it's very manual, because a lot of the time you may have 20 or more names for the same food item. So they've collected enough data points that they can kind of automate that and piece that all together. But what that process has prevented has been appropriate labeling of regenerative or even organic food items. So appropriate value has been hard to ascribe to those actual food items. So this goes a long way in helping appreciation for food items produced in that manner.
And I mean, of course, in this case, they are not investing. I mean, they're investing in technology, but it's not that they have to build an enormous factory. So there is potential there that your investment dollars go a bit further than if you have to set up a massive robotics factory or something like that. In that theme of transparency and getting more dollars to, or shifting, let's say, the food dollar spent, have you made other investments that are, of course, they're all exciting, but other investments that we have to talk about?
Probably. We have made other investments that are worth talking about. There's a few that we can touch on. Right. FoodMaven falls into that software category. We've made another software investment in a company by the name of Swarm Engineering. I mean, essentially, they're democratizing AI to find supply chain solutions for food and ag companies. So really helping them to optimize efficiency, but also enabling them to solve for sustainability characteristics in the process.
Because when you say Swarm Engineering, it sounds like a robotics company, but that's maybe just my thinking about swarms, but it's not the case. So how would you describe that as what's a use case for Swarm Engineering? What's a typical client?
So yeah, a typical client, let's say it could be, I don't want to disclose specifics of who their customers are. I think,
is it a supermarket? Is it a restaurant chain? Is it a hospital? Is it a private person like me?
It is typically it could be a conventional ag company. It could be a big brand name company, food and ag company as well. And basically, they may be using Swarm Engineering. So basically, Swarm provides this library of algorithms that they develop or aggregate and basically apply to food ag companies after they fill out an interactive questionnaire. So some of the use cases for that would be really solving for proper blending of inputs, load balancing, resource management, and routing appropriately, but also layering on sustainability metrics, or also enabling better selection of sustainably or regeneratively produced ingredients in the formation of a product. So in some ways,
it's really on the recipe blending side of food processing, not in a bad way, but of course most food is blends, most food are mixed, and figuring out better or different mixtures.
There is the blending aspect and better mixtures component to it. There is the logistics component. There is, and some of that logistics is appropriately routing some of that regeneratively produced food. In some ways, it's a bit of an extension to what How Good offers, which you've looked at and talked about before. But that being a sustainability database, you can appreciate what certain food items do in terms of moving a product from degenerative to sustainable to regenerative. This really enables the company that's putting that product together to help find that product or find that ingredient and get it to the source so that that product can be made.
Yeah, and you mentioned regenerative meat, so let's unpack that a bit. What's the investments you've made in that space, and what is regenerative meat in this case?
Yeah, in this case, it is a cultivated regenerative meat company. So broadly, we recognize regenerative meat faces some real challenges in scaling, and O-meat represents a much better alternative to CAFO meat until it does. So really what O-meat is bringing is a very compelling technology. It enables cost parity with the current options out there because it's got a growth medium that reduces the cost 99%. They partner with regenerative ranchers by placing bioreactors on the farm to couple with the land and really provide them an additional income stream. It increases the output of regenerative cow by 20 to 100 times and replicates the regenerative nutrient density of a regenerative cow. So, checking the boxes of improving farmer outcomes, scaling regen meat in one way, localizing the system and reducing negative externalities. So,
and it is okay, let's unpack that one a bit. So it's I would say many people probably would say, ooh, cellular ag or cultivated meat.
Sure.
I can see them cringe, basically, although this is a podcast. And but you're saying we're doing this localized, working with the regenerative ranchers and basically taking a cow that has all the nutrient density, has been on pasture his or her most of its life, and use that as the input. Because that's always the discussion in these. What are the growth mediums? What's the input? What's the energy costs? How we're going to build these massive facilities that we've never done before at this scale. The only time we've done it is at medicine facilities, but they're much smaller. And you're saying we're taking a much more decentralized approach and using as input the regeneratively grown, if that's even a thing, the regeneratively grown cow as an input, and sort of 20 or 100x that in terms of protein output. Which sounds very interesting. Is nobody else working on that? Is that like O-meat I've never heard about it. Is that an exception there to take that partly farmer approach almost to cultivated meat?
Yeah, we think it's unique, and that's exactly why we like it so much. And I think that is a proprietary process.
You say it's a transition, or it's a until it scales enough. But this could also be the scale. Like, do you see this as a temporary solution, as an end solution potentially, or how do you see this in let's say the scaling of regenerative meat production or pasture, etc.?
The
tricky
pure
question.
regenerative meat production we absolutely support and want to scale, but recognizing even if that increases tenfold, that gets to 10% of the market. So that's going to take a long time, and we're going to further the development of that in the process. But in the meantime, this does present a potential alternative for conventional incumbents to replace actual CAFO meat. And as a result, in the spirit of being a bridge builder and working with some conventional ag companies at one end and regenerative companies at another, there are some conventional participants that are looking to be involved here and actually start to use this product when it is ready for market. So, we're encouraged that this could be.
How far is this for market? Like when can I eat this? Depending on where I am, obviously.
It's early stage. It's going to be a few years. Well, I should say it's early. I should say, sorry, it's going to be a few years before it fully scales. But of course, there are samples and beef ready already, just not at a commercial scale yet.
And you mentioned it holds that nutrient density that were known and that actually draw you to the space to begin with of the pasture raised and proper pasture mixture, holistic management, etc., or mob grazed, whatever we want to call it. So have you seen that under, I wouldn't say under a microscope, but like, have there been lab tests showing that what comes out of these bioreactors compared to, I'm almost saying the standard one, but there's no standard here, but against the bioreactors of the ones that, let's say, don't pay any attention to the input of where the cells come from. Have we seen differences there already? Like, can we see those nutrient differences, or is it too early for that?
So you can look at those, and we did discuss that. As you can imagine, this warranted some healthy debate. This warranted some healthy debate internally. So, well, yeah, hopefully this is not too proprietary, and you cut it out if it is at the end. But so really, yeah, basically all the inputs, the cells, the growth medium, the scaffolding are all directly taken from the cow in really what is a minimally invasive biopsy. So basically you get the molecular, cellular, DNA, and nutrient density level that's more or less identical to the meat from the cow. That's been tested, and that's what the results have shown.
Wow. And how difficult is it because I see these, it's interesting because we've had, not on the podcast, but we had a company present, a tonic actually, on decentralized insect growing, to keep it at a farmer's level, to make sure we don't have to transport all of the inputs and outputs, because there's a lot of fertilizer coming out, good fertilizer, not the chemical one where we pay certain countries. But there's a lot of moving around of stuff. But then always the question is, okay, it doesn't make sense to centralize it in a big facility where you control everything, but you also have the risk of infectious and the whole thing goes down? Or does it make sense to decentralize, but then you're not on top of it constantly? Like, how difficult is it to run? Will it be to run like a bioreactor like this? Does an average rancher need to get a biomedical degree or a bioengineering degree to be able to run this? Is this remotely? Like, how tricky is this to do this decentralized? Because it sounds super nice, but I'm also thinking, what if something goes wrong? And it's a long drive to replace something or to go and check. You lose the whole vat basically of bioreactor. Like, what's the skill level needed to keep this running and to make sure that the protein comes out on the other end?
It's still going to be a significant facility, and it's going to be selective ranches that make sense for it. But, it's not going to necessarily be the rancher who's running it. The company is going to be on site facilitating that. They've got a team and the leading scientist in the world in the space leading that effort. So really, they're going to be the ones addressing that. But So why is it then to do it on site? Is it that easy access to the growth mediums to the cows? Do you need that? Or is it mostly to add revenue to the farmer? Like, what's the driver of this decentralization? Like, do you need to be close to the source? Is that helpful in this case? I have no idea if freshness is important here or not. Like, is that a thing? Or otherwise you have to transport a cow with a lot of stress to a facility 7 hours down the road. I mean, I can imagine that's not the point, but, or like, what's the proximity here? Why does it matter so much? Being close to the source is a major driver. But of course, being able to partner with the rancher and necessarily being able to focus on regenerative ranchers is certainly an added benefit. And how do they respond to this? I can imagine the cringe on their face. Like, we're going to place a bioreactor, and like that's going to need some convincing, I think, or do they click quickly and get on board with, we can 20x or 100x your work, basically your work on the protein side, not your work obviously on restoring the land, because there you still need the animal footprint. But we can sort of, there's a multiple here that you don't see, because otherwise you have to 20x your herd, which is definitely needed, but not so easy to do. No, very good question, very important one, and certainly one we thought about. I mean, as we were going through the diligence process, we called up, really, even before we made the investment, we were working hard to work with the team and, see what we could do to, of course, build our confidence and conviction, but also help them further their plans. And so in the process, made a lot of calls to ranchers. And, I don't want to speak out of turn, but it would be some names that you recognize and people you probably know. So significant regenerative ranchers, and they were very receptive to it. And so we're having conversations with the company now. But you're right. I mean, you would, it requires some explaining and
to your investors probably as well. So okay, this I think we very interesting to follow this. And other ones that you're excited about, or things you're still missing. Let's say if you look at a portfolio overview, like I would love to have company because we're really missing, I don't know, a remote sensing one. I'm just the first word that popped into my mind. What would be nice from a portfolio level to still have, as you're obviously going to make quite a few more investments and then follow up investments over the next years?
Sure. I would say one of those categories that I particularly would like to fill is a fintech company. And fintech come in a variety of forms, but broadly speaking, a company that falls in that space. We've looked at a number, haven't quite got there yet, are talking to a few now, so are optimistic that happens soon. But
and really to focus on economies for the farmer, or what fintech, what should it address? Like really significantly move the needle for like the business side of the farmer and the rancher? Is that what you're looking at? Because I think there's a lot of space to improve there for sure.
For sure. I think it's improving access to financing options in one way. So it could be, of course, you've had Dan from Stewart on a few times. Of course, they're a terrific example of exactly the kind of fintech. But
you didn't invest, right?
We did not. I know you are in. Congratulations.
We're very just full disclosure, very small investor that let us in. But yeah, it's been. We didn't set any terms. Let's say it's a few thousand, but it's. I'm very happy to be part of the journey because it's I hope there will be more, honestly. But it's such a crucial and such an underappreciated and neglected space. Like how to get more. Not VC money, also that, but more quote unquote boring money into the space, loans, etc. And banks are just not there to provide it for people that want to grow.
And that's right. I think we see some opportunities there where, the banks have not evolved. They're still incredibly opaque. And, it takes forever to actually get a loan approved. So anything that's really helping to improve financing options for farmers is a big step in the right direction there. And there are a lot of opportunities out there. So no doubt you've seen a few financing platforms and a few that unfortunately Trailhead was just not off the ground just yet to be investing in those companies. So
there will be more. There will be more. But it's a massive space. There's so much refinancing needed. There's so much, and it's so difficult to get loans or to get. Not even the time, but it takes forever if you even get it. And it just really stales an industry that wants to grow and can grow and wants to meet consumer demand, and it's just not there, or it's the solutions are not there. But the money is out there, so those bridge builders are crucial and very interesting. I wouldn't have expected you mentioned fintech, but it makes a lot of sense.
I think it's a good example of some of the ways I think about VC in food and ag right now. Absolutely. The rest of VC can be leading examples of some of what's to expect in the space, and food and ag is just somewhat lagging in that, which is understandable given the inherent points of friction, and you just can't iterate on a daily basis and instead essentially have annual harvests that require things to move a little bit more slowly. But again, that's accelerating, and you can see where fintech for the broader world has gone in the last 10 years, and you could see a lot of potential for that in the food and ag space to come.
Great. And let's shift gears a bit to a few questions I always like to ask, not necessarily at the end, but in this case, where are you contrarian? We've touched upon a few points, definitely inspired by John Kemp, this question. So where do you, when you go to RFSI, I always mix it up, the Regenerative Food System Investment Forum, which is going to be in Colorado, actually, in October. So all go, please. We might be there, not sure yet. But when you are there and you're with, let's say, the bubble of regen investments, where do you think fundamentally different?
Yeah, I think trying to be the bridge builders that we are, maybe a contrarian point of view is that big ag will be part of the solution. It's, it's hard to fight those incumbents when they have such a vast amount of capital and resources, and really feel there are benefits to swinging them in the right direction by offering them some accretive expansion opportunities. But of course, we're seeing it now. You also have to establish standards and hold them to them. So that is one area that feels like a bit of a contrarian point of view. Also would say that innovative food and ag capital doesn't need to be concessionary, and that doesn't mean it's extractive. We've probably covered that, but I think, yeah, again...
Doesn't hurt to repeat it, yeah.
Perhaps the reminder is needed. And, it's not always, the dots aren't always connected there. I mean, like basically mission-driven venture capital really should be win-win-win. If you're investing in businesses that are necessarily impact-oriented, VCs are minority shareholders and everybody's incentives are mission-aligned. So, from my perspective, that means you just got to ensure you've got patient capital. And so, we've been very conscious about pursuing LPs who are mission aligned and appreciate the timelines. But again, longer timelines shouldn't mean, any compromises on returns. I mean, I think some of the best investments ever are long-term holds. I've heard, like in the case of Google, John Doerr never sold, and you can imagine what that is. And, take Sequoia, for example, who just established an evergreen fund for longer hold periods. So,
This opens a whole rabbit hole. Are we going? Yeah, we're going there. We're going there. What do you, there's a question there, obviously, on the evergreen structure, which is not the current fund structure. Is it something you are thinking about for like next funds? As I know, if this fund is successful, and probably it will, this is not, you don't stop here. Like, is it something I'm not saying planning, because you're definitely not planning, but thinking about, okay, what would a fund 2 look like? And is evergreen then something, or a longer period fund, something you are interested in or potentially exploring?
It has been a consideration. I think when we got things off the ground, we didn't want to complicate them any more than necessary, just pretty much with standard terms and structure. So it's certainly a consideration in the future. In an ideal scenario, I kind of like the concept of a Berkshire Hathaway, where you can, accumulate a portfolio of companies and partnerships that, where we could be perhaps a little bit more value add and active in those efforts. I think you take the case of Berkshire, where they're clearly passive, but they do provide, some network benefits there. But with that structure, yeah, exactly. I think you have some aggregation of resources and network effects, and really the intention to hold those forever. So there's some appeal to that. But then to your question about future funds and how at least I'm thinking about this, and we're comparing notes on this internally on a daily basis. I wouldn't say daily, but on a regular basis.
Are the LPs ready for that? Like, potentially, is there enough interest potentially? It will be a few years before you did it. Like, do you see, would it be possible to raise a 50 million like you're doing now, or 50, or more? Like, is this, or is it mostly we need to stay in the lanes, at least in terms of fund structures, to be able to raise enough to put it to work as we have 10 years left, or 9 years, or whatever the number is, to make a dent?
Yeah, I think if the consideration is an evergreen fund or some other kind of structure, it's a conversation to be had when that additional fundraising starts. And since we are still wrapping up the first fundraise, that conversation is going to be down the road. But it's certainly a consideration. I think the intention for the next fund would be, very much in the lane and very consistent with what we were pursuing at this point. But necessarily a bit larger fund, so we can expand the ecosystem, community, and
a double. You always have to double the second one, right? Yeah, that's the 2x the double. And so, what if we took that away and you actually tomorrow morning, which is in a few hours only for you? I'm very sorry for this late call, and I'm going to be conscious of your time and wrap up soon. But what if you be in charge of $1 billion fund, and it could be an holding structure, or like you don't have LPs, you won an enormous lottery. You have to invest it though. There's one condition. But a timeline could be, or horizon could be extremely long, extremely short. But where would you prioritize this? Where would you put that to work in the food and ag sector? If the food and ag sector, maybe you put it somewhere else, maybe nuclear fusion. But what would you focus on mostly? I don't need the exact dollar amounts, obviously. I just need what are your top sectors or sub themes you would put money to work if resources were sort of unlimited?
Yeah, I think it would be a bit of an expansion of what we just started to touch on. First, that similar early stage but larger fund. It would be a few different pockets of capital because, again, a few different pockets are needed from our perspective to address all the opportunities and needs within the food and ag system. So, another one would be a land and infrastructure fund, which, is necessarily a different risk and return profile. I'd want to add a pool for something like Mad Ag's perennial fund for progressive transition financing. And then maybe something like what Stephen Hohenreiter is doing at Grounded Capital. Basically a fund for moving aspiring, well-sized, well-established companies and food brands to move along the curve from conventional to regen. I think that's needed and momentum worth building on. But maybe that's not all of the money, and you got to put a little bit of a pocket fund for just policy and education.
Lobbying is probably the highest potential investment, but yeah, it's not something we covered a lot. We'll do a few interviews on that. It's not my favorite topic, but yeah. But it's so important, but not the most sexy subject to talk about. And as a final question, if you had a magic wand and you had one, you could do it once only, and don't start like I would do 3, etc. Just one. What would you change in the space or in the sector or globally? It could be anything. I've said before, better taste buds or global consciousness or everybody's meditating. I mean, it could be literally anything. What would you use your magic wand for?
Just one.
Venture capitalists always want to make multiple bets, etc. In this case, you just have one. Yeah.
I think that's going to have to be a tax on negative externalities, like greenhouse gases. Broadly speaking, certainly wary of, any revenue distortion there, but I think that's got to be the one option or one string to pull. I mean, there are a few others. I mean, if the wand could be waved, there are a few other thoughts that on where wishes could be spent. But yeah, I think that's the one that's at the top of the list.
We have to start paying for externalities. Yeah, it feels like we're moving slowly in that direction. Of course, we're going to have an endless debate about carbon equivalent and which is way too simplistic, or CO2 equivalent, and other things, but at least let's start somewhere. Like, you cannot on a finite planet treat it like it's an infinite waste dump like we're doing now, basically. And that has to stop. There's no way around it.
Certainly agree with that. And as we're talking through it a little bit, another wand to be waved, but very much in line with this. I mean, now that you mention it, is really, could food be priced based on nutrient density? So certainly appreciate what Dan Kittredge is doing there. But, if that nutrient density is in line, it is inherently incorporating better soil practices and better use of that land. And
did you see the paper coming out of David Montgomery, and Anne?
I had not yet.
I will put it in the show notes. So they published the paper recently, a few weeks ago. And I think it's part of their upcoming book. And I hope, because he already mentioned it when we interviewed him many years ago, that they're working on a book on nutrient density. And they've shown a very significant connection between soil practices, so farming practices and agriculture practices, and the nutrient density. between conventional, organic, and farms that have been on a regenerative journey for, I think, at least 15 years. And they looked at beef, pork, a number of grains, and a number of vegetables. And very small sample size, we shouldn't get all too excited about it, but it feels like a sort of watershed moment. Like it feels like that there's somebody that did a team of researchers, obviously, it wasn't just David, but to show that connection between healthy soil, healthy produce, healthy gut. The next level is healthy gut and healthy people, but at least let's show the healthy produce side. And there were significant differences even between higher end organic meat like beef, and I think that they looked at Gabe Brown's farm, and the regeneratively grown, or the let's say the pastures that have been on a long journey. They could show significant differences, which is interesting because we buy the higher end organic, but it could still be higher end organic soy and corn that has been fed to these cows, and it just doesn't show coming back to the earlier discussion on beef, it just shows in the end result, which is very, very interesting. So I hope we're going to see a lot more research, but this seems like quite a significant milestone in, let's say, the nutrient density space. So I will put the paper below. It's super readable. I read it, which means it is readable. And we hope to have David and Anne on the show soon to unpack this and where that research is going.
Terrific.
And I think that's also a perfect end to this conversation. I don't want to keep you any longer because it's very late. And appreciate very much this update, and of course the story of how you got here, but also the update on Trailhead Capital. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, Koen. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? What questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space. For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, ag-tech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution.
It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.